Please welcome ALEC Counsel and Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer, Bartlett Cleland.
Thank you, Governor Sununu, for those thoughtful remarks. It's those 25-hour work days that you just mentioned that leads to my congratulations on you receiving the 5 stars in that Laffer ALEC report that we heard about earlier. Just as New Hampshire has correctly fought back against out-of-state tax collectors reaching across state lines, it goes right in the list of things that have been going right in New Hampshire. New York and other states are now actually trying to figure out how to reach across their state lines, imposing their social justice agenda via state antitrust laws. New York now wants to change its antitrust laws so that interstate businesses will have to comply with New York standards. State laws are now at risk because large states like New York want to become the national leader in antitrust. As challenging and as unprecedented as 2020 has been, we'd be in a far worse position if not for the innovations in 2020. Companies have stepped up across the spectrum. New ideas have been allowed to flourish. They've been implemented in states across the country. But one way this is often hurt is through an overreaching government, like limiting our First Amendment rights through content moderation of large universe of ideas that you find on the internet. Now, how does this all come together? Joining us with a brief video hello and his thoughts is Representative Bill Seitz. Most of you know him, a longtime ALEC member and one of our board members, also the majority floor leader in Ohio. He has lots of experience in antitrust. Well, let's go to Representative Seitz and he can tell us his thoughts. Let's watch his message.
Hello, my ALEC friends. I'm Bill Seitz, majority floor leader in the Ohio House of Representatives. Wish I could be there for the entire program, but we have session this week in Columbus, so it's a busy time, and that's why I agreed with Steve Del Bianco to do this pre-recorded message on why antitrust is the wrong remedy for a real problem. The real problem, of course, is bias among the big tech companies. We saw it during the recent election. We see it every day as folks with contrarian views are censored off of Twitter and disciplined for their views. That's wrong. But anyone who thinks antitrust is the right remedy is equally wrong. I have practiced antitrust laws for 42 years. And during that entire time, we have ceaselessly worked towards adoption of a consumer welfare standard as the primary objective of antitrust. In this effort, we have been very successful, and the U.S. Supreme Court has adopted our views almost completely. In Europe, they have a very different standard called an abuse of dominance standard. It makes advising clients on EU law very difficult because the abuse of dominance standard is a terribly subjective standard, whereas the consumer welfare standard that we have in the United States looks to what is in the best interest of consumers. We look to protect competition, not individual competitors, and we look to maximize consumer welfare by promoting low prices and abundant quantity. Now, as applied to big tech, none of the big tech villains enjoy more than 40% of any legally discernible market. That, my friends, falls far short of the threshold needed to establish a monopoly. If it could ever be proven that the big tech giants colluded among themselves, either tacitly or expressly, to censor conservative viewpoints or to raise price profitably or to do other nefarious things, then we would have a great remedy in the antitrust laws. However, there is no such proof at all that the big tech giants have, in fact, colluded in such a nefarious way. And therefore, to those who want to do something about this problem, I would suggest that the better remedy is for consumers to take advantage of the choices that they have. If you do not like the way Twitter is treating conservative viewpoints, sign up for Parler. Sign up for another site that is more harmonious with your own views. Similarly, the case with Facebook, the case with Google. We have choices. And the best remedy for whatever abuse folks perceive among the big tech giants would be for people to exercise that freedom of choice that we guarantee to folks in a free enterprise system. So with that, I'm sure you're going to have a lively discussion. I can tell you that that it is not really the appropriate way to address this problem to try to scrap long fought for consumer welfare standards in favor of a vague and subjective European Union standard of abuse of dominance, which is in the eye of the beholder and therefore makes counseling businesses a very uncertain thing. Thanks very much, and I look forward to you all having a great program today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We truly appreciate it back in Ohio. Let's go ahead and turn to our panel. Joining on the screen today to discuss Section 230 and the necessary role of government, if any, when it comes to private companies' content moderation is a great panel of experts, including some I've known for a long time. First of all, Barbara Comstock. How you doing, Barbara? Former Congresswoman, Virginia delegate, a member of ALEC who boasts antitrust expertise. You may have seen Barbara recently on ABC News. Also, we have Steve Howick, former New York Attorney General antitrust chief during the Microsoft case. He's been on CNBC lately in an interview. And finally, Carl Szabo, who is one of the leaders here at ALEC and has been a longtime member leading the CAT task force. He's the Net Choice General Counsel and a professor at George Mason Law. He's testified most recently in the U.S. Senate Judiciary hearing on antitrust against big tech. How are y'all doing? I hope you're all well. I pray you're all well. Barbara, let's just go ahead and just get right into this. You just heard Bill Seitz, Representative Seitz, said there is a competitive market. What do you think about that?
Well, I think he's exactly right. And as he pointed out, the consumer welfare standard is the gold standard. When I was both in the Virginia State House and in Congress, I was privileged to represent the late Judge Robert Bork, who set that antitrust standard that we now operate under. And I think it's very important that we keep it, because you look at the competitive markets, you know, we're here on Zoom, you know, Google and Microsoft, WebEx, they all have these platforms too. But Zoom came, you know, through the pandemic here and worked very well. We also had all of these companies compete in the education market. My husband's a teacher, and, you know, all of these companies were very active in providing, you know, business tools for our businesses, for education. So these markets are changing. They're very dynamic, and it's very important that we keep them that way, because that has been a bipartisan, you know, keep the regulation out, something that ALEC really understands, something that the great Governor Sununu just outlined also. So I think it's important that if we want to have innovation in the 21st century solutions that we want, that we allow our tech companies to continue to compete and be innovative.
Now, we've also heard, back to you, Barbara, for a minute. We've also heard around DC, and of course, we all grin when we start a question that way, but we've heard around town that there are currently efforts underway to use antitrust laws to solve political problems and concerns like raising the minimum wage. Is there a smart use of antitrust law? What are the potential challenges, the problems of that?
No, well, you have people like Chairman Cicilline of the House Judiciary Committee, a very liberal Democrat, who does want to use antitrust to just promote his political goals. They would like to also, as I think Representative Seitz pointed out, they could go into other areas. If you open this door, they could, you know, impose the Green New Deal and try and do antitrust things in the energy sector. So this would be, you know, to politicize antitrust the way the EU does would mean we wouldn't have the competitive markets that we have. You know, we, in the top 20 technology companies, the US has 11, China has 9, the EU has none. So when I hear members of Congress, and unfortunately there are some Republicans too, but Chairman Cicilline is really the leader, a liberal Democrat who's never been, you know, for market-oriented solutions pretty much in any area. And when I hear anybody, left or right, talk about following an EU model, that would mean we would no longer be competitive. And I think that would be very dangerous in a world where China is our top competitor, and we don't want companies, you know, or Europe or other companies, you know, going the way of China. We want to have the US model be the dominant one, the innovative one, and not cede our leadership.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And actually, as I'm thinking about this, let's back up just slightly and let me throw it over to you, Steve. You've been at this antitrust game for a while, to say the least. Give us an idea. What is antitrust law? What's its purpose? What's an easy way for people to digest that? And how is it being mischaracterized?
Well, so I think the easiest way to boil it down, it can be complicated, but basically its primary purpose is to serve consumers by giving them the benefits and preserving the benefits of the free market system. Supreme Court has said that our antitrust laws are the Magna Carta of the free enterprise system. So as people have said, the standard we use has come to be called the Consumer Welfare Standard. And the basic idea is to serve consumers. You know, competition can be tough, and competitors that can't keep up because the prices are too high or they don't innovate playing. But the key thing is to give consumers wide choice, low prices, make sure, as Barbara said, they get the benefits of an innovative economy. Now, some critics, the so-called neo-Brandeisians, mainly criticize the consumer welfare standard because focus is not true. The consumer welfare standard is pretty broad. It encompasses issues like choice, the impact of what companies are doing in innovation. And in fact, 20 years ago when I was trying Microsoft, those issues were considered by the court. So to say that it focuses solely on price is just incorrect.
Thank you very much. I think people probably have a better digestion of antitrust and what it's all about because of that. Carl, I mentioned just a couple minutes ago how people chuckle when anyone starts a conversation or a sentence with "we here in D.C." So let me just stipulate that we know things get a little twisted up in Washington, D.C. But what do we know right now about antitrust action in Congress and the ideas that are being promulgated there? And, if there's any insight into the next Congress we can take from what we know right now.
Thanks, Bartlett. And really sorry I can't see everyone in person, of course, COVID. But when it comes to DC, DC always knows best, or at least that's the thinking of a lot of people here. They'll sit and say, well, antitrust law should work this way, or you know what, it's really hard to pass a progressive agenda like Green New Deal, or it's really hard to pass a populist progressive agenda like raise the minimum wage. So isn't there a simpler way we could do this? And then, aha, we can do it through antitrust law. And that's what you're seeing right now coming out of DC. Basically, a progressive agenda that is being used to be advanced in antitrust law. And what we're seeing right now is it's being focused primarily on the tech industry. But as Congresswoman Comstock mentioned, it is much more than tech. When these antitrust laws get weaponized by people like Chairman Cicilline or many others of the quote unquote neo-Brandeisian efforts to advance their progressive ideals, we're all going to suffer. So essentially, the antitrust attack on tech is an attack on all of us, just it's a Trojan horse for populist proposals. Now, what are those populist proposals? Well, I'll give you one example. We've heard in the state of New York. Now, this is where it really comes to the state lawmakers who are listening to really be mindful. New York, this past session, introduced an approach to fully amend their antitrust law. And when their state attorney general was asked, what would this do? She responded, well, we can use this to solve things like racial discrimination. We can use this to advance minimum wage. And it's not just going to stop at New York, because as we've learned from California with its privacy laws, one law in one state oftentimes has a spillover effect into every other state. So for all the great work that Governor Sununu is doing to cultivate and recruit businesses to come to his state, New York's arms will quickly be reaching across borders and reach into the businesses that are seeking to go to New Hampshire and avoid New York City. And so once again, it's coming from DC, it's coming from Albany, it's coming from Sacramento. States, federal government, localities are trying to use antitrust law, trying to rewrite antitrust law so that they can advance progressive policies on the rest of us.
That's super interesting. And actually, you've just added to my knowledge, piqued my knowledge. I've often referred to antitrust law as the mall of progressive, the largest mall of MAUL, of the progressive trend for the last 140 years. I'd never thought about its impact on state legislators and governors who are doing a great job. So thanks for raising that. I think it's very important. Somewhere else I don't know a whole lot about, Barbara. We've heard some ideas about a GlassSteagall for the internet. What in the world what does that even mean?
Well, it's a very bad idea too, and that's something that Chairman Cicilline is propounding, and it's the idea that you can't have somebody who's a seller also be, controlling a marketplace. And, they get upset because, Amazon might have brands or, and how tech companies are able to combine things that actually make, give us free products, give us, more access. But what it would mean like, for those of us who shop at Costco, they carry various brands, but then they have their own brand, Kirkland, right? So that's okay. We can buy different brands. We get to choose what brands. You go to CVS and you can get your name brand products that you might want there, or you can buy CVS vitamins if you want to. Macy's, when you go shopping at Macy's, they might have different designer clothes, but then they have their own Macy's brand. So, or makeup and the same kind of thing. So this goes on in brick and mortar stores, and it also goes on online, and it shouldn't be something that government comes in and regulates how, what's going to be on the online shelves or what's going to be in the physical shelves. And I would like to point out for those state legislators, who are here, Carter Glass, who was the author of the GlassSteagall Act, didn't just have bad ideas on market and reforms. He was a Virginia state legislator who was a racist. And some of his other really bad ideas is he led the way to add a poll tax and a literacy test in Virginia. So why anyone would want to adopt a guy who was not known for good policies and now apply that in the 21st century when those were bad, he had bad ideas in the early 20th century. This is not somebody, and he was a Virginia Democrat, I would like to point out, not a Republican. So this Virginia Democrat's bad ideas are not something we need to be following on the state level or on the federal level.
Okay, I'm learning all kinds of stuff today in this panel, not least of which is a great history lesson. But let me make sure I understand this. So when I go to the grocery store, if I were going to buy stick butter, and it's branded with Harris Teeter or Kroger or whatever, you're saying that would suddenly become a problem online to do the similar, for me to save a couple pennies on all of my products so that I have more money in my pocket. So as I follow this,
or buying,
Mom and Dad
when you buy soda, you go in and they would have Safeway Cola or whatever cola that you'd have, or you'd have Coke. Now, sometimes Coke and Pepsi might pay for that prime real estate on the edge of the aisle, right? And maybe the Safeway Cola wasn't there, but it was there as an option. And, for those of us who are pinching our pennies, we always appreciate that. But then for those of us who really liked the brand name and don't take my Diet Coke, I need it, I want it. But this is such a competitive market. When people talk about there's not competition, I would remind them that just, in our life, just a little over a decade ago, Nokia phones were leader in phones. Now you have Apple and Android, competing. You think, how many, you can look back just a few years ago and see magazine covers that say, gee, can their dominance be stopped? So when you talk about government coming in and deciding, they understand the tech market, a lot of these members, in Congress don't understand, how to get online and do things. You see these funny pictures of, how they can't even set up their their room, to do a Zoom call. You don't want them to, start regulating and making predictions on what's going to happen in technology, because even the technology companies can't themselves. A year ago, most of us weren't on Zoom. Now we are. But I would remind people there are a lot of other online products that you can do what we're doing right now. Zoom just happened to, get in and take a chunk of this market. And it represents the innovation that is alive and well in tech. And as we as conservatives always understand, you change or die in any of these markets and innovate So having government come in and eviscerate that innovation would be disastrous.
So at risk of having you repeat some of your great answer there, so what does all this mean for antitrust law? I mean, for example, how should free marketers view the approach of consumer welfare as a basis for antitrust analysis?
Oh, is that I'll let my colleagues
I'm
here.
sorry. Yep. No, I'm sorry, Barbara, or anybody for that matter.
Yeah.
So Bartlett, I'll grab that one. So what you're starting to see, and Steve alluded to this at the outset, is a movement away from what's called the consumer welfare model on which antitrust law operates. Now, the thing about consumer welfare model, in essence, what it is a objective test. It looks at the facts, it looks at the data, and it says, okay, based on these facts and data, is there a problem here? Is the market some sort of distortion? Is there a supreme barrier to entry for new entrants? And it's an objective-based test. And one of the things that Congresswoman Comstock alluded to is history. And I think oftentimes our history is forgotten on this because we've tried other models before. Governor Sununu mentioned in his statements just a couple minutes ago that as an engineer, you try things, and when they don't work, you try something else and see what it works. We have tried this subjective standard that is now being promulgated and promoted in DC, in New York, in Sacramento, of a subjective standard, kind of a antitrust. I know when I see it, I, the government, somebody sitting in Albany or Sacramento or Washington, DC, have suddenly decided you business are too big. You business are too big. Granted, there's not a lot of data to back that up, but I feel like you're too big. So I'm going to break you up. That's where antitrust law actually started. When it started way back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, that's where we started. This kind of subjective, I know when I see it, rule for antitrust enforcement. And what we saw is over the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we started to see antitrust law be abused. We started to see it be weaponized by politicians. We started to see it be weaponized by competitors. And as a result, as we moved out of the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, the US Supreme Court began unanimously recognizing this fundamental flaw in our antitrust law. And so since the mid-70s, the US Supreme Court almost unanimously, repeatedly, has decided the consumer welfare standard is the best one. I mean, you have justices like Thomas, as well as justices like Ginsburg and Sotomayor and Kagan, all agreeing, Scalia and Ginsburg agreeing that consumer welfare standard is the best way forward for the country. So we've tried these failed approaches in the past, and what you're seeing now is kind of a ignorance or disregard for our history, an attempt for some to seize control that they lost over the many years, as we recognize that we want to put consumers first. Antitrust law, surprisingly, is not about protecting corporations. Antitrust law is surprisingly not about protecting competitors. What is it about? It's about protecting consumers. Now, when there's no competition and you have one entity start to raise prices or shake down consumers, well, yeah, that's consumer harm. That's a pretty clear-cut case of antitrust enforcement. But when you have four businesses of equal size, one is just slightly larger than the other, making smart business decisions, no one in their right mind would call that anti-competitive, but there are some in Congress, there are some in Albany, there's some in Sacramento who would say that's anti-competitive, not necessarily because the facts show it, but maybe just they don't like that business. And so that's essentially where we are with consumer welfare. And that's why we need to vehemently oppose new changes to it, like a proposed GlassSteagall for the internet, as the Congresswoman alluded to, or a movement to what's called abuse of dominance, whatever the heck that means, which is essentially in the eye of the beholder. We need to maintain antitrust law as an objective-based standard and not allow its weaponization by politicians or corporate competitors.
So let me pull at some of those threads. Yeah, go ahead, Steve. I was going to even
on what Carl said, and emphasizing what that this approach has been bipartisan. It's the approach selected by a number of judges over history, last 120 years. Most of them probably a lot smarter than I am, and it's Republicans and Democrats. And maybe the best example, again, that I worked on for the D.C. Circuit, it was the entire bench, not just the panel of three, but 7 judges who upheld most of the district court's decision in favor of the plaintiffs. And it was 4 Republican-appointed judges, 3 Democrat, and one of them is an outstanding antitrust scholar, Doug Ginsburg, used to teach the subject at Harvard. And then again, going back to my Microsoft case experience, we certainly found, 20 years ago, that it wasn't necessary to get the law changed to prove and make a successful case. We used the consumer welfare standard. We succeeded because Microsoft's conduct was harmful to consumers. And so there wasn't really any need to change the law. If you have a good case, you can bring it the way the law is. The state AGs, I represented the 20 state AGs in that case. They all can sue in federal court under the Sherman Antitrust, their federal law. So they don't need any change in state law to give them additional powers to enforce the antitrust laws. And then finally, I would say that to date, there are many state antitrust laws, almost all of them, either explicitly by judicial fiat or interpreted to be consistent with the Sherman Act, the Federal Antitrust Act. And it's just hard for me to conceive how impossible it would be, as Representative Seitz said, to, for somebody who wants to obey the law, to understand even what the law is, when it's going to be different in New York and different in some other state law. Apart from the fact is, I think Carl and others have said, I think adopting this abusive dominant standard would be terrible because, as Barbara pointed out, one of our most vibrant sectors of the economy is tech, and it protects innovation, it protects them. So I think the bottom line, it's a bad idea, necessary in my view.
Steve, let's stay with you for a second. One of the issues everyone's been talking about is the Google antitrust case, and they're usually comparing it to the Microsoft case that actually happened when I was on Capitol Hill. Are these the same situation, and does the DOJ even have do they have a strong case? Do they have any case?
I think they have a very weak case. I could spend 25 minutes on this. I know I don't have that time. So let me try to talk fast and be very brief. So, one major difference, I think, is there's no consumer harm in the Google case. And Microsoft is charging high monopoly prices, and everything they did was to protect their ability to do that. Here, most of Google's products are free, and there's wide choice. You can have multiple search systems, search engines, and browsers on your computer and your mobile, so that isn't a problem. And there's a tremendous amount of innovation, and that's really the problem the competitors have had, is keeping up by improving the products and innovating. So that's one major difference. But I think the most important difference really is the key of any monopoly case, which is the conduct. So Microsoft did all these terribly bad things that are not normal business practices. They were, Bill Gates and others were making threats to people. If they didn't carry Microsoft's products, Microsoft would cut them off from Microsoft products they needed. They were binding their products into the operating system, so you couldn't get rid of them and you had to use them. They were cutting down on consumer choice. But to me, the really biggest difference is the key thing that the DOJ hangs its hat on, which is Google has a contract. Google search is set as the default search. That doesn't mean other search engines can't be on there. And it's 180 degrees to what happened to Microsoft. Apple made a decision that they wanted to carry a rival product, Netscape Navigator, rather than Internet Explorer browser. Bill Gates heard about it. He called them up and he said, if you don't carry our product, even though you think it's worse than the other products, we're going to cut you off from or office suite which you need to sell products. So Apple succumbed. Here, it's really just the reverse. Apple's made an independent decision on Google search because consumers like it, and in their view, it's the best product. And so the government is essentially, I think, if they were successful, would be trying to force Apple to give consumers a product that Apple doesn't want to give them, and one that like, Apple and most consumers don't like.
Thank you on that, Steve. We're in the home stretch here, so let's get to some brass tacks. Barbara, who really benefits from these breakups? What's the bottom line?
Well, you know, what the internet and what our tech companies have done, it's been the democratization of media where everyone can get access and you can get out there and get your story told. You can go viral on all kinds of platforms. And I think it really makes content is king. Now, from a political standpoint, I think what it would be is mainstream media, your networks. I mean, I work with ABC. I love them. I think they're the best network. But also, it would also give more control to your newspapers. Now, I was a conservative female Republican in a pretty hostile media market in the Washington, D.C. area. I represented just outside, Northern Virginia. And so I use social media, and I'm sure many of our, I know in the state legislature, it is less costly to use your advertising. We don't have lots of money to, in a state race. And it really helps us. And I can tell you, I'm on the board of Winning for Women, which is to elect Republican women, and ViewPAC, also electing Republican women. We had some really great races here. I'm also on the board of Republican State Legislative Council that just had unexpectedly good returns for our state legislators, which I was thrilled about. And I know in mentoring a lot of them and counseling them, they found what I found, which is the use of social media is their best way to bypass what is sometimes hostile mainstream media and get your message at a lower cost directly to people and be able to also test your ads. When you put an ad in a newspaper, you don't know who's reading it or just turning the page. When you put an ad up on, Facebook or Google, you can test those metrics. You can target it to the audience you want to and make sure you're reaching people. And particularly during this pandemic, we were working with a lot of people to make sure they were reaching their audiences, in a very difficult environment. So I think particularly, for women, for minorities, for people who are trying to reach, a whole different audience, and as conservatives, that social media being dismantled would, in fracturing these platforms, would make it much harder to reach our audiences, reach mainstream America, and it would make it more costly because we know social media the costs have come down 40%. Your ads, you get a better return. And that's why the mainstream media kind of gets upset with it. I'm sure, I did a lot of TV advertising and cable advertising too, but every year I was in office, I diverted more over to social media because I saw a better impact there. And 8 out of my 9 races, I won. I wasn't supposed to win any of them. And I would give a lot of credit to social media.
That's a heck of a baseball record, I'll tell you. You could be the star hitter for the Nationals with 8 out of 10 home runs. So we have about 2 minutes left. I've got 2 questions. So pithy answers, please. Is this really all about big tech? Is this just we hate big tech and we want to bust it up? We want to do something?
So Bartlett,
So one of the points I'd like to make, if I can, is the law of unintended consequences. If the state legislatures change the law, having in mind big tech, actually is going to affect as much or more many other companies that have market power in certain markets like newspapers, taxi cab companies, pharmacies, and it's going to create a lot of local havoc, I think. So be aware of unintended consequences.
Go ahead, Carl.
And Bartlett, I don't have to speculate. I know the purpose. I'll just read to you from Bernie Sanders' campaign platform. Federal judiciary and antitrust agencies have been hijacked by right-wing corporate-aligned ideologues who've made the failed Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork's idea of consumer welfare their guiding principle. There you have it. Bernie Sanders, a man who believes that the government is a solution to all of our problems, wants to fundamentally undermine the consumer welfare standard that has prevented the government from seizing control of businesses to make them do what they want. And that's what we're fighting against right here. So yes, it is much, much, much more than technology. It's about going after agriculture. It's about going after greenhouse gases. It's about going after pharmaceuticals. And once again, technology is but the Trojan horse for the progressive policies. And I implore every state lawmaker to recognize this attempt to seize control by the government of private entities, not for the benefit of constituents, not for the benefit of consumers, but for the benefit of consumers and government. And that's what we're all talking about here. And that's why I get so passionate about this.
And it shows. Last question.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with my colleagues here because, and I always like to point out, as a former recovering politician, is that the rating of Congress is about 18%. When you look at the popularity, the rating, approval ratings of these companies, they are very high. They are in the 70s or the 80s. These are the companies that brought us through the pandemic and allowed us to connect with our families, with our businesses, with our schools, and get through this crisis time. Our innovators are also the people, as pointed out, in the pharmaceutical area, who are now, worked through speeding up the process with less regulation to get us these cures too. So this is an attack on innovation. And even though some Republicans have joined in on it, I would really implore my fellow state legislators, because I know that's where real things get done on the state legislative front, to not, listen to the siren song that is really coming from the European Union model, which is not an American model at all.
All right, you guys have kind of answered it. You anticipated me. Let's do 10 seconds each person. If you have anything, tell me the one or two things that a state lawmaker can do to stop this attack on the free market right now. Carl, you want to start?
Yeah, when you see legislation introduced suggesting that we follow Europe or follow a populist proposal to amend antitrust, just say no. Just say no.
Just say no. Barbara, anything?
Yes, I would again just say no, but also talk to your innovators in your community, in your districts. You will see those are the people who are providing the jobs, who are donating to your communities, and really get to know them and understand them, and understand the infrastructure and the ecosystem that they are creating, so that you can have a state like Governor Sununu highlighted. He's a great innovator in this area.
And finally, Steve, anything to add?
Well, the one addition I would make is, I come from a state AG background, and state AGs have much fewer resources or government. Traditionally, they've concentrated those resources on matters that are unique to their states, that directly affect consumers within their states, maybe a little differently than what happened in other states. So I would want to make sure those resources are being expended in that way, not being the federal government is doing and probably can do better.
All I'm left to say for this is thank all three of you. You're fantastic. I loved preparing for this. I very much enjoyed sitting here today. I've learned a lot, some from each of you. And then a special thank you to NetChoice, honestly, for being a longtime friend and partner at ALEC, but also for sponsoring this panel. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Bill Seitz, wherever you are. And thank you, Governor Sununu, for your earlier remarks and innovation and leading New Hampshire as a Laffer-Alec 5-star governor.